Good evening, dear viewers, and welcome back to Sinister Signal, your home for the most bone-chilling tales from the darkest corners of fear itself. Tonight, we bring you a story so terrifying, so unsettling, that you might want to leave the lights on. A remote mountain town, a series of disappearances, and an ancient horror lurking in the shadows. The moonlit vanishings will take you deep into the unknown, where every whisper in the dark could be your last. If you enjoy horror stories that make your skin crawl and your pulse race, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Sinister Signal, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a night of terror. Now, settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself, if you dare. The town of Black Hollow slumbered beneath an ink-dark sky, nestled deep in the jagged arms of the mountains, a place of forgotten history, of old names spoken in hushed voices. No roads led to Black Hollow without intention, and none left without leaving something behind. The disappearances began generations ago, always on the full moon. A pattern whispered between the cracks of candle-lit porches, murmured through trembling lips at the town's only bar. One night, a child, another, a hunter, sometimes an entire family, their beds left cold, their doors swinging open in the wind. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just an eerie silence where life once was. Stay inside on the full moon, the townsfolk warned. Lock your doors, cover your windows, and pray. Mara Lorne never believed in prayers. A journalist with a past she refused to revisit. She had come to Black Hollow chasing the story that others feared to write. There had been another disappearance last month. A boy, barely 13. His mother still stood at her doorstep each night, calling his name into the empty woods. Tonight the full moon glowed like an unblinking eye in the sky. And tonight, Mara would learn what truly lurked in the shadows of Black Hollow. The Black Hollow Inn was a relic of the past, its wooden walls thick with a scent of age and dust. Mara sat at the bar nursing a watered-down whiskey, her notepad resting beside her, pages filled with half-written theories and dead-end leads. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Roy, wiped a glass with the same rag he'd been using all night. "You shouldn't be here, Miss Lorne," he said, without looking up. "I could say the same to you," Mara replied, watching his eyes flick to the frosted window where the full moon cast eerie beams across the floor. Roy sighed. "I live here, you don't. That makes all the difference." She leaned in. "Tell me about the disappearances." The room went quiet. A handful of locals, hunched in the dimly lit space, turned their heads just enough to make it clear they were listening. Roy set the glass down. "Ain't much to tell that you don't already know. Every full moon, someone goes missing. Never any sign of where they went or what took them. No theories." A man at the far end of the bar scoffed. "Oh, we got theories, all right." He was old, his face like cracked leather, his voice brittle as dead leaves. "But no one ever comes back to tell us the truth." Mara tapped her pen against her notepad. "Has anyone tried to leave on a full moon?" Silence. Then Roy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "One man, Preacher Amos, back in '62, said he was going to walk right out of town, show everyone there wasn't nothing to fear." Mara leaned in. "What happened?" The old man down the bar took a long sip of his drink before answering. "We found his boots a mile outside town, just his boots." Mara's fingers tightened around her pen. Something was out there, and it was coming tonight. She left the bar before anyone could stop her. Stepping into the cold night, She inhaled the crisp mountain air. The full moon hung unnaturally bright, casting long twisted shadows from the trees that lined the outskirts of town. She made her way down the quiet streets, past darkened houses, curtains drawn tight. No one was outside. No one ever was on a night like this. Then she heard it. A faint whisper. Her breath hitched. The wind was still. There were no rustling trees, no voices. And yet, there it was again. A whisper, drifting through the air like a breath on the back of her neck. Mara turned sharply toward the woods at the edge of town. The darkness beyond the tree line was thick, absolute. But something moved within it. A shadow. No, shadows. They slithered between the trees, twisting and merging like living smoke. A chill ran down her spine. And then, a scream. High. Piercing. Echoing. From the depths of the forest. Mara ran toward it. Mara sprinted toward the forest, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The scream had come from deep within the trees, a raw, terrified wail that sent icy fingers crawling down her spine. She hesitated at the edge of the woods, peering into the dark. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, casting shifting, uncertain shadows. Another scream, closer this time. Mara pushed forward, the damp earth swallowing the sound of her footsteps. Cold air burned in her lungs as she weaved between towering pines, each branch reaching for her like skeletal fingers. Then she saw it. A figure stood in a small clearing, a head hunched and trembling. A woman, her dress torn, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She turned slowly, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto Mara's. "Help me," the woman whispered. Mara rushed forward, gripping the woman's arms. "Who are you? What happened?" The woman sobbed. I don't know. I was in my house and then..." Her breath hitched. "The shadows took me." Mara frowned. "Shadows?" The woman nodded frantically, eyes darting over Mara's shoulder. "They move. They whisper. They..." A branch snapped behind them. Mara spun around. The air grew thick, heavy, wrong. The darkness itself seemed to pulse, shifting unnaturally at the edges of the trees. Shapes emerged. Figures, tall and thin, their forms indistinct, as if they weren't made of flesh and bone, but of night itself. The whispering returned, low, insidious. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The woman let out a choked sob, clutching at Mara. "They want to take me back." Mara grabbed her hand. "Run!" They tore through the forest, branches lashing at their skin. The whispers swelled into a cacophony, the sound of 1,000 voices speaking at once, words too garbled to understand. Mara risked a glance back. The shadows were moving fast, gliding across the ground, closing the distance. The edge of the forest was close, just a few more feet. Then the woman screamed. Mara turned, just in time to see her body jerk violently backward, as if invisible hands had grabbed her. Her eyes widened in terror. "Don't let them take me!" Mara lunged forward, grabbing her wrist. The woman's body twisted, her feet no longer touching the ground. The shadows wrapped around her, pulling her into the dark. Mara tightened her grip. "Hold on!" But the whispering grew deafening, and the woman's form began to dissolve. As if she were turning into the very shadows that consumed her, her eyes locked onto Mara's, pleading. And then she was gone, swallowed whole. The whispering ceased. Mara staggered backward, gasping for breath. The forest was silent once more. She turned and ran. Mara burst from the tree line, her breath ragged, her hands trembling. The town of Black Hollow stretched before her, but it felt wrong, as if she had stepped into a place where time had slipped, where reality was paper thin. The streets were empty. Not a single porch light flickered. Not a single window revealed a watching eye. Had she imagined it all? Number, the woman, her terror, it had been real. Mara pulled her phone from her pocket, fumbling with the screen. No signal, not even a flicker of service. The moment she had stepped into the forest, she had left the modern world behind. A cold wind rolled through the town, and then she heard it. Not a whisper this time, a voice, soft, familiar. Mara. She froze. The voice had come from behind her. Slowly, her fingers curled into a fist. Her stomach twisted as she turned. A figure stood in the middle of the street. A man. Her breath caught in her throat. Dad? He looked just as she remembered. Tall, weathered, his face lined with years of quiet sorrow. But he had been dead for over a decade. Mara's legs locked in place. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her father took a step forward. His eyes held something unnatural, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. You shouldn't be here, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice thick with sorrow. You need to leave. Mara took a step back. This isn't real. His expression flickered, his mouth twisting into something that wasn't quite human. You don't belong here. She shook her head, her pulse roaring in her ears. You're dead. The thing wearing her father's face tilted its head. So are they. Townspeople. Mara turned just as they appeared. Figures stood at the edges of the street, silent, unmoving. Their faces were familiar, their clothes old and tattered. People who had disappeared over the decades, lost to the full moon's curse. Their hollow eyes stared through her. Go, her father whispered, before they take you too. But Mara couldn't move. The figures began to step forward. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were unsure whether they were meant to be human or shadow. Mara forced herself to breathe, to think. If she ran, where would she go? She needed answers. Now she turned back to the figure that had once been her father. What is this place? A flicker of something human crossed his face. Black Hollow isn't what you think. What do you mean? The whispering returned, soft at first, then rising into a terrible chorus of voices. Her father's expression darkened. They're coming. The sky above shifted. The moon seemed to pulse, its light turning an unnatural shade of red. The shadows at the edges of town began to writhe. Mara took a step back. Tell me what's happening. But her father was already fading, his body unraveling into strands of darkness. The whispering voices merged into one, a deep, guttural sound that rattled inside her skull. A name. Mara. The figures stopped moving, and then the shadows rushed toward her. Mara turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to escape. But Black Hollow wasn't normal anymore. The streets twisted and changed, shifting beneath her feet, leading her back to the center of town no matter which way she ran. The ground trembled. The air thickened. A sound filled the night. Laughter. Deep. Guttural. Not human. Mara stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. And then she saw it. The thing that had been waiting for her all along. It stood in the center of the town square, towering, its form wrapped in darkness that never stopped moving. It had no eyes, yet it saw everything. It had no mouth, yet the whispers came from within it. It had always been here, It raised a shadowed hand. Mara felt her body freeze. And in that moment, she understood the truth. The full moon, the disappearances, the town's silence. Black Hollow wasn't a town. It was a trap. A place that fed on the lost, on the forgotten, on those who stumbled too far into the dark. And tonight, it had chosen her. Mara's limbs refused to obey her. The thing in the town square held her in place, its shadowed form shifting like a living void, its presence pressing down on her chest like an unbearable weight. The whispering intensified, threading through her mind, weaving doubt, fear, and acceptance. No one leaves. She gritted her teeth. Number. That wasn't true. She wasn't going to be like the others. She wasn't going to disappear. But the figures around her, those who had vanished before, stood silently, watching with hollow eyes. Their faces flickered between recognition and something else, as if they still remembered being alive, but had long forgotten how to be human. Mara's father, if he had ever truly been her father, lingered at the edge of the square, his face twisted with something like grief. "Don't fight it, sweetheart." She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. "I'm not like you." The thing in the center of the town moved, its shadows spiraling outward, stretching toward her like tendrils. Her vision blurred. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in the town square anymore. She was in her childhood home, her old bedroom, untouched by time. The posters on the walls, the faded bedspread, the creaky wooden floor beneath her bare feet. The scent of old books and lavender candles filled the air. She knew this wasn't real. Yet, the sight of it wounded her. The door creaked open, and her mother stepped inside. Mara stopped breathing. Her mother had died when Mara was 17. A brutal accident on a lonely road, leaving nothing behind but shattered glass and blood-stained pavement. But here she was, smiling. "Mara," her mother whispered, stepping closer. "It's okay. You don't have to run anymore." Mara backed up, her legs trembling. This wasn't real. "This isn't real." Her mother's smile didn't falter. "You've been lost for so long, sweetheart. Let go. Come home." Mara shook her head, pressing her hands to her temples. The walls of her room seemed to breathe, shifting in and out of focus. The thing was inside her mind now, trying to break her. A cold hand touched her arm. Mara screamed, yanking herself away. The illusion shattered. She was back in the town square, back beneath the blood-red moon. The figures stood closer now, watching in eerie silence. The thing at the center loomed over her, its whispering voice curling through the air. "You are already mine." Mara's body burned, an unnatural heat crawling beneath her skin, wrapping around her spine. She was vanishing, just like the others. Number, no. She clenched her fists, focusing on the sensation of her nails biting into flesh, on the cold air whipping against her face. She wasn't gone yet. She wasn't dead yet. The town had trapped her yet. But traps could be broken. Through the haze of pain, her eyes flicked to something beyond the figures. The church. The only place she hadn't gone. The only building that still had light spilling from its stained glass windows. A sanctuary. Or just another piece of the nightmare. It didn't matter. Mara tore herself free from the invisible force holding her, forcing her legs to move. And then she ran. Mara sprinted toward the church, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The figures of the lost loomed on either side of the road, watching, waiting. But they did not move to stop her. The thing in the square, however, did. The whispering swelled into a roar, 1,000 voices screaming inside her skull. The air thickened, pressing down on her, as if the very fabric of Black Hollow was trying to swallow her whole. She stumbled, but did not stop. The church doors stood open, a golden light spilling from within. It was the only warmth in this forsaken place, the only refuge. She threw herself inside just as the shadows lunged for her. The doors slammed shut behind her with a deafening boom. Silence. Mara collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her chest heaving. The air inside the church was heavy with the scent of old wax and aged wood. Dim candlelight flickered along the walls, casting long, trembling shadows. Slowly, she pushed herself up, and her eyes scanning the interior. The pews were empty. The altar stood untouched, but she was not alone. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the church. An old man. His robe was tattered, his face gaunt, eyes sunken deep into his skull. He stared at her with something between relief and horror. "You should not be here," he rasped. Mara staggered forward. "What is this place?" The old man exhaled, his hands shaking as he clasped them together. "A prison," he whispered, "and a feast." Mara swallowed hard. The disappearances, the shadows, the voices. The old man nodded. "It feeds." Mara's stomach twisted. "Feeds on what?" His hollow eyes met hers. "On the ones who stray too far. On the ones who come looking for truth." His voice wavered. "On the ones it calls." She shuddered. "How do I stop it?" A flicker of something crossed the man's face. Something like hope, quickly crushed beneath the weight of despair. "You can't," he murmured. "No one can." Mara refused to accept that. "There has to be a way." The old man hesitated. Then, slowly, he pointed to the altar. "The bell," he whispered. "The town's old church bell. It was blessed long ago, before Black Hollow was swallowed by the dark." His voice trembled. "It is the only thing it fears." Mara's gaze snapped to the bell tower above them. A way out. A weapon. A sudden force slammed against the church doors. The entire building shook, dust falling from the rafters. The thing outside had found her. Mara spun to the old man. "Help me." His face was grim. "I'm already lost." Another boom rocked the church. The wood splintered. No time. Mara turned and ran for the stairs. Mara's boots pounded against the worn wooden steps as she ascended the bell tower. The structure trembled around her, the air thick with the weight of something unnatural pressing in from all sides. Below, the church doors burst open. The shadows poured inside, writhing across the stone floor like living tendrils, consuming the candlelight with their unnatural hunger. The old man didn't run. He simply stood before the altar, his hands clasped in silent prayer, as the darkness swallowed him whole. Mara didn't look back. She reached the top of the tower, breathless, her body trembling with exhaustion. The bell loomed before her, a massive, ancient thing, its surface tarnished with time. A thick, frayed rope hung beside it, the only means to ring it. She seized it. A voice whispered behind her, "Mara!" Her grip on the rope tightened. She turned. It stood there, the thing, no longer outside, no longer hiding in the shadows. It had taken shape, a towering, shifting mass of darkness, its form ever-changing, its face an amalgamation of those it had consumed. For a moment, it wore her father's face, then her mother's, then her own. Her own voice joined the whispering. "You cannot escape. You belong to me now." Mara's mind fractured beneath the weight of its presence. Memories, thoughts, fears. It was pulling them apart, unraveling her from the inside out. Her fingers loosened on the rope. let go. She could feel herself slipping, her will draining away, the whispers wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. It would be so easy to give in, to stop running, to become part of the town. Number no. With a raw, defiant scream, Mara yanked the rope with everything she had. The bell tolled. The sound ripped through the night, a deep, ancient reverberation that sent shockwaves through the air. The thing screamed, a sound that was not human, not of this world. The shadows convulsed, twisting violently, recoiling from the bell's chime, as if burned by holy fire. Mara pulled again, another toll. The darkness fractured. The figures below, the lost souls, the townspeople, staggered, their hollow eyes flickering with something like recognition. The town shook. A deafening wail erupted from the thing's shifting form as the bell rang once more. The darkness peeled away, disintegrating, revealing what had been buried beneath it for centuries. For a moment, Mara glimpsed the truth. Black Hollow was never a town. It was a place of devouring, a trap that had existed for generations, feeding on the lost, the forgotten, the curious. The bell's final toll tore the veil apart. The thing collapsed inward, screeching, twisting into itself until it was nothing but a whisper on the wind. And then, silence. The silence was deafening. Mara stood in the bell tower, her hands trembling as she released the rope. The air felt different now, lighter, clearer, as if something ancient and oppressive had finally been lifted. She staggered to the edge of the tower, looking down at Black Hollow. The streets, once twisted and endless, had settled into something normal. The buildings no longer flickered like illusions. The oppressive shadows were gone. And the people, Mara's breath caught in her throat. The figures that had surrounded her, the lost souls, were changing. Some collapsed into dust, their forms unraveling into the wind, remnants of those who had been held for too long, their essence drained beyond return. Others, a few, remained. Their hollow expressions faded, replaced with confusion, relief, grief. They were alive again, or at least as alive as they could be after what they had endured. The church bell had broken the curse. A sob echoed from below. A woman clutched at her own arms, staring at her hands as if she couldn't believe she was whole. An older man fell to his knees, weeping. Mara's eyes darted through the crowd. And then she saw him, her father. For a moment, he stood there, looking up at her. His face no longer an imitation, no longer a trick. It was him, real. A warmth spread through her chest, but he wasn't staying. His lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, and he was gone, fading like smoke in the morning sun. Mara closed her eyes, swallowing down the lump in her throat. It was over. She descended the tower, stepping back into the church. The doors remained open, the first rays of dawn filtering through. The red moon had vanished, replaced by the soft hues of a new day. She stepped outside. The survivors turned to her, silent, watching. They knew. She had saved them. She had freed Black Hollow, or at least what was left of it. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool mountain air fill her lungs. The town no longer felt like a trap, no longer held that suffocating weight of something unnatural lurking beneath its skin. But she knew the truth. Some places never fully die. Some horrors are only buried, not destroyed. And as she walked away from Black Hollow, never looking back, she couldn't shake the feeling that one day it would wake again. When it did, someone else would have to ring the bell.